Hi folks! So this lecture covers similar stuff to my other Illusion of Depth lecture, but it just uses different images and illustrates it in a different way. So if you didn't quite understand or intake the information from the last lecture, hopefully this one will be helpful. Okay, so just to review, atmospheric perspective is a set of techniques used to create illusion of depth in 2D art. Now, most of the examples I give in this PowerPoint are related to landscape, and we will go over this again when we work on our landscape painting, just to give you a chance to relate it to both landscape and non-representational art. But atmospheric perspective can be used for either of these. The main difference being you'll see in landscape, a lot of the vertical placement logic is used, where generally stuff that's meant to look closer in space is lower down on the picture plane, and stuff that's meant to look farther away is higher up. You don't really need to follow that for non-representational because you're working more with shapes, lines, colors, that sort of thing. Although some non-representational paintings do have landscape inspiration and do use some of that logic, so that's certainly an option. Okay, so this is just a recap of the different techniques you can use. So just as a reminder, also I included keywords here, and this is useful. So cool colors are just colors that contain relatively more blue than other colors around them. Warm colors are colors that contain relatively more orange or yellow than other colors around them. Complementary colors are colors opposite one another on the color wheel. Hue is just a fancy word for color. Value is the darkness or lightness of a color, and saturation is the intensity or dullness of color. This is just a little cheat sheet to make sure you understand what I mean when I use these words. Okay, so if you're working with color in a painting and you want to create atmospheric perspective or an illusion of depth, those can be used interchangeably. Use cooler colors as space recedes. You can also lighten up your colors by adding white as space recedes, and you can reduce the saturation as space recedes. Lightening your colors will also reduce the saturation, so that's two birds with one stone. If you add more white to your colors, that will lighten them and reduce the saturation. Okay, so rule number one is that warm colors pop forward in space and cool colors tend to look distant or far away in space. This is a really simple example where warm earth tones appear closer than cool earth tones. Now they're being used in tandem with overlapping of shapes and also relative scale, so shapes get smaller as they are meant to look farther away in space. Another way to think about this is if you're working with a cool color scheme, but you have greens and blues, a warm lime green is going to pop forward a lot, whereas a pale blue sky is less saturated and also lighter, so that's a great color for the background. Even if you just focus your eyes generally on the lime green area and the blue sky, you can just see how much of a difference there is and how much they appear to pop forward. Okay, so here the artist chose mainly pinks for the foreground, purples for the midground, and then a blue for the sky. And this works well because the layers become cooler as space recedes. So we've covered this one a bunch of times, but just to reiterate, you can always make a tint of your colors or add white to them, which is making a tint, to help them look like they're getting farther away. A really simple example here is that large dark shapes or large dark areas of colors tend to pop forward in space, whereas the colors get lighter. They also tend to get more saturated, not always, but as they get lighter and desaturated, they look farther away in space. This also happens in real life. If you're hiking in the mountains, for example, you might notice that colors literally do lighten with distance in real life. This is a digitally created image, but it's a great example of how colors get progressively lighter and lower in contrast as space recedes to create illusion of depth and a really realistic feel to the digital image. There's also some blurring or sfumato in the background, which helps add depth. you can almost think of it like a camera. You want the objects that you wish to appear closer in the painting to be in focus, and the objects you wish to be far away to be out of focus. Another example here. Okay, we've already covered this for the most part, but definitely decreasing the saturation of colors, so making colors more muted and earthy, brownish or grayish undertones as space recedes. You can really see that here in this Bierstadt painting. So if you were to translate this to a non-representational work, you could take the same color schemes and say you were working with spheres. You could use the more saturated greens for the spheres that you wanted to be up close, and then use the grayish blues for the background and the tiny spheres in the distance. And you could do that with any shape or type of line. Okay, so just to recap, methods you can use to decrease the saturation or the intensity of a color is to add white, add gray, or add the color's complement. So whatever color is opposite on the color wheel, add a little bit of that in. So think of this as colors become whiter and grayer as space recedes if you want to get that illusion of depth or that atmospheric perspective. So to review again, this is just a summary of other techniques you can use to create illusion of depth besides atmospheric perspective. So remember, we've got overlap, relative scale, vertical placement, linear perspective. Vertical placement you may not want to use in your non-representational painting, but you can. The houses at the top of this image are a great illustration of that. For most viewers, you are going to read that bottom row of houses as being closer in space than that top row of houses, even though they're exactly the same size and they're not overlapped at all. Similar with the spheres, to most viewers, they will read that lower circle as closer in space and the higher circles as farther away in space. I've talked to some students about this, and some students don't see this, so if you happen to not read images this way, that's okay. Not everybody does. The red and blue circles are just a really basic illustration of the idea of overlap, where fully visible objects in the composition appear closer, and then objects that are layered behind appear farther back. This can also be called layering, but I think overlap makes more sense to most people. And this is something you will want to include in pretty much every composition you design, unless you have a really specific reason not to. And then last but not least, relative scale, at least as far as the simple ones go. Relative scale is just that large objects appear closer and small objects appear in the distance, especially if they're the same sort of object. The larger the change in relative scale, the vaster the illusion of depth will be. So on left, you can see the trees do get smaller, but not in a really extreme way. So we get a more limited illusion of depth there. Whereas in the Andrew Wyeth drawing on the right, we've got this giant tree right up close and these really tiny trees in the distance. So there's much more contrast in the scale changes, and that creates a vaster illusion of depth. If you wanted to create something like this in a non-representational work, maybe you're working with lines mainly, and you use really thick, bold lines for the closest part of your composition, and then really soft, light, and skinny lines in the background, and that creates that illusion of depth. Okay, there are some other words for relative scale that you might hear just out in the world talking about art, or you might hear me use, and these include diminution, diminishing scale, or relative size. All of those words mean the same thing. You can use whichever one makes the most sense to you to understand this concept. At left, this is an example of relative size in that we relate the figure to the house in the background, and this will be more relevant when we start working on a landscape painting. But basically, we understand the human body to be roughly a certain size. We understand that a two-story house would be roughly a certain size. So we perceive a certain amount of distance based on the sizing of those two elements of the painting. Once again, that wouldn't really apply to non-representational works as much, but it's still really interesting and will be relevant later on. Here we have relative scale and vertical placement happening at once, but no overlap. So overlap would be a great thing to add here. And generally, realistic artworks will use a combination of overlap, vertical placement, and relative scale. For non-representational, non-realistic artwork, I'd say definitely use overlap and relative scale as part of your composition, but you can skip vertical placement unless you want that sort of landscape, allusion to landscape in your composition. Okay, so these are all video games that past students have told me they enjoy playing, and we took a look at stills from some of these, just to kind of see how illusion of depth was created by the game designers. So in this one, the main thing you guys will notice is that the warmer colors are reserved for the foreground, and then the midground and background are very cool in color. Also, there is addition of more white into each layer of color as the trees recede in space. This video game still actually breaks some of the illusion of depth rules in that the colder colors are used up close and the warmer colors are far away. However, you still get really nice illusion of depth here because we have linear perspective being used. We also have much more high contrast and detail in the figures, which are meant to look the closest. We have diminishing scale, diminishing size, and we just have the colors getting lighter as they go back in space. So there's a bunch of reasons why this still works, despite breaking one of the rules. So here there is a reduction in color saturation and also in contrast as space recedes. It's a very desaturated image in general, but the most saturated colors are in the foreground. Also, the brightest, whitest colors are in the foreground, and then the background is very low contrast. So we've got high contrast moving into low contrast to create illusion of depth. Other thing you might notice here is there is some linear perspective or diminishing size in the window above the figures, where those rectangular pieces of the window get smaller as they go back in space. Here we have a lot of classic atmospheric perspective techniques where colors reduce in contrast, they get lighter, they also get cooler overall as space recedes, and we also have relative scale and diminishing size of objects that creates a vast illusion of depth. So hopefully at this point you're seeing a pattern in all these different techniques. And here once again, reduction in saturation as space recedes. Also reduction in contrast, cooling of colors. You can think of the reduction in saturation as the muting of colors in the background. This one also breaks a rule in that there are warmer colors in the background, but because there is reduction of saturation overall and relative scale, we still get a nice illusion of depth here. This one once again breaks that rule with the warm background. However, we've got big dark objects in front, and then objects get smaller and lower in detail as they recede, and also the way things that are overlapped and layered give us a sense of how this illusion of distance is meant to read within the image.